How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Wrench. This is Chess.com, and this is the next installment in the Pawn Structure 101 video series. Here today to continue our coverage and review of the Scheveningen pawn structure, Scheveningen, however you pronounce it. Today we move on to Black's perspective. As you can see, our board is flipped. We are looking at it from the perspective of the second player, as my buddy Dejan Bojkov likes to call the black pieces. And I think we did a pretty detailed job and really covered the most critical of White's plans within the structure. Obviously, when we talk about the pawn structure, we try to really break it down for you to see the bigger picture as far as all the long-term features and plans of a position. That's really what the pawns define, and that's what positional chess and long-term strategy is all about, is the pawn structure. But of course, we also like to talk about the middle games and the plans that develop and the common tactics that occur within the pieces, with the tactics that occur within each particular pawn structure. So hopefully we did justice to White's perspective, and obviously just because we're looking at it, quote unquote, from the Black's perspective now, does not mean that we will not discuss White plans and White counter plans, just as we did already mention some of Black's critical ideas in the first few videos of this series. Before we move on to discussing exactly what the title of this video says, which is supposed to be an introduction to Black's ideas and Black STEM ideas, as I like to call it. There are STEM ideas and STEM games in every opening, every structure. A STEM game is something, of course, you sort of memorize or commit to your memory, at least, as far as something that represents all the critical ideas for you when you play your opening. And so there are STEM ideas and STEM plans and STEM games in every position that you should just kind of have there in your knowledge in any opening you play, so that it's always a part of your approach. But like I said, before we move on to discussing exactly what the title of this video says, I want to remind everybody what the Scheveningen structure is. So we'll just make the first few moves of the opening, and obviously we know we can reach this structure through a few different move orders. This position here being the most common one from an open Sicilian. Obviously e6 is a move here that would actually go directly into the Scheveningen opening. Remember that when you discuss a structure, it's key that you're understanding the ideas, and that we will look at multiple different move orders. In fact, in today's video, because we're discussing and trying to display a lot of what Black needs to do well, we're going to be going over a game by none other than maybe the greatest Scheveningen/Najdorf player of all time, that of course being the only Garry Kasparov. And doing so, we're actually going to be looking at a lot of positions via the Najdorf move order. But I wanted to remind everybody that this officially is the Scheveningen structure, these two versus this one. And of course, you can go back to the Scheveningen intro video where we talked about the basic ideas for both sides. You can back up to that video a few videos ago to if you want to review those principles. The move order that we're going to be discussing that reaches the Scheveningen structure is via the Najdorf. And there are multiple ways to get a Scheveningen structure for Black after you play the Najdorf. Even after bishop e3, there's e6, which we can get an English attack structure. We're going to be discussing that in kind of an entirely new section or installment in this Pawn Structure 101 video series. We're not discussing the Scheveningen structure versus an English attack in this particular section. But I just wanted to point out that you could get it there, and so bishop e2, we may see positions like this, where Black can transpose into Scheveningen opening lines, or continue to play it with a Najdorf-style development. There are different things that define a Najdorf-style development, but one of the critical ones is that Black is more aggressive with the minority attack, and often this knight finds itself going to d7, heading into squares like this. That's kind of an oversimplification as far as what separates the Najdorf development from the Scheveningen development, but it is one of the key things that the difference is the development of this pony here, heading to d7 rather than c6, and usually it's just slightly delayed for Black, who chooses to extend the minority attack on the queen side in a more aggressive manner. So that it can be reached that way. The Scheveningen structure can be reached this way. Of course, on both of these moves, e5 is also an option, but again, that's not what we're discussing here. It's not opening theory, but the Scheveningen structure. But I'm just noting that of course, is possible. But in order to get a lot of the real critical STEM ideas across today, the game we're going to be reviewing is the game Tiliskin versus Kasparov, but it's also got some different analysis that I've sort of cooked together, a little recipe here for us to review and see what exactly Black is trying to achieve. And we're going to do that via the Sozin. which is bishop to c4. Bishops to c4 was a line that was maybe the most popular way for white to play against the Najdorf in the late 60s, throughout the 70s, even into the early 80s, and of course it was played, for a long time after that. But I would say that it's not considered the most effective approach against the Najdorf. This is at the highest level. It's still very dangerous, and it's a very straightforward development for white. It makes a lot of sense when you think about putting the bishop on this diagonal as far as how white would like to play against a Scheveningen structure. One of the things, of course, we talked about for white is the driving of the f-pawn. And so if you think about how would you want to coordinate your pieces as far as attacking a Scheveningen structure, putting a bishop on this diagonal, helping the knight and the pawn increase pressure on these critical squares, it doesn't make any more sense than that now, does it? And obviously you know that it's very hard for black to ever play a move like e5 against a Sosen development, because white has already increased its control over the d5 square. So the Sosen development sure does make a ton of sense. Don't mistake me saying that maybe it's not the most accurate, or let's say the most commonly played at the highest level anymore, if black really knows the right approach. And a lot of that is due to the work of course, the man we're going to be looking at today, Garry Kasparov. His efforts against Nigel Short in their World Championship match, and against a lot of others in the late 80s, early to mid 90s, sort of broke down exactly what black wants to do against this. But in any case, while we're discussing what black wants to do, I'll try to remind you of some basic stuff along the way. But we're going to be looking at two particular things that define the Najdorf version of the Scheveningen versus the mainline Scheveningen. That because black is more aggressive on the queen side, and because the difference in terms of the development of this knight, it does change things a little bit for white, where he can't just sort of be ultra aggressive anymore with these f5 and e5 moves. And if he does, they'll backfire in certain ways. And so that's one of the things we're going to try to accomplish or establish in today's video, is try to see what's going on there. And so of course here we see the move e6 officially getting into the Scheveningen. White plays bishop to b3. There are other moves possible too. White doesn't necessarily have to retreat right away, but it makes the most sense to take the bishop out of the line of fire. Potential tactics: attacking the bishop, maybe even attacking the knight next. So white will often just retreat this bishop to b3. And after b5, in today's game, what we're going to be looking at is castles, bishop e7, and with f4. Noted should be that 8 f4 right away is also a possible move order that will reach the same position we get in the game. And different depending on someone's approach, there's also moves like bishop b7 here, and even against castles there's moves like bishop to b7. But we're not going to spend too much time discussing the move order per se, because what I want to focus on is how the transition into the middle game and how the structure is handled. That's what we're going to highlight in today's game. So we're going to talk about castles, bishop to e7, f4, black castles, and now we see a common position where white has several moves. The most common and considered sort of the best these days is the move a3. We're going to talk about a3. We're going to talk about the move bishop to e3. Even moves like queen e2 are possible, but hopefully you'll start to see how black's development and plans sort of come together, and we're not really that worried about which move order white chooses. Before we get to a3, which is the best move here for white, I want to talk about what happens on either one of these early pushes. e5 is the most dangerous for white, and it's one that will strike a little bit of fear into Scheveningen players if they're not totally prepared for it. The idea is obvious, but white is trying to dislodge the knight from f6, which in turn will perhaps make the king side more of a target and allow white to launch an attack. In a perfect world, he'd bring the queen out, do a rook lift, and lights out against the black king. Of course, we're going to see that, especially in the way that Kasparov handled this game, that's why I chose it as a stem game. Often against the Najdorf development, this early e5 push is basically just considered bad now, and we're going to highlight exactly why an early e5 is not really possible for white. Mainly you'll see that black will neutralize white's attack and eventually target this e5 pawn, which of course is isolated, and it may in the end be something where you see that white's king comes under fire if he opens the position too aggressively. And these eventually, like I said, after black defends the attack, these diagonals will become an issue. So let's see what happened here in this game with Tilliskin and Kasparov. After e5, d takes e5, f takes e5. Black simply played knight f to d7. Noted should be that bishop c5 is always an interesting idea as like kind of an intermezzo before you deal with the obvious threat here. It was played next, so we're not going to focus too much on in this move order. After something like bishop e3, knight fd7, queen h5, we'll actually have a direct transposition into what happened in this game. So not super relevant, and so black decides to just put immediate pressure here on the pawn, which kind of makes sense, by the way, because if white chose bishop f4 as a way to deal with the weakness of the e5 pawn instead of queen h5, in a lot of these positions now, the diagonal becomes much weaker, and there are immediate tactics for white as far as dealing with the issue here, with the open diagonals and the king, obviously, the knight being pinned. So knight fd7 is a move order that makes a lot of sense. Of course, white plays queen h5, and after bishop to c5, bishop to e3, you can pause your clocks if you want for a moment to think about how you would approach this position. There was a lot of theory in a lot of games earlier to this. White, of course, won some really impressive and dangerous attacking games that really sort of launched the next few years for white as far as white trying to make these ideas work. But we're going to see that I'm not going to sit here and show you the entire history of all the mistakes black did and all the ways that black maybe underestimated or allowed white's attack to get out of control. We're going to focus on exactly what black needs to do in order to punish white for the early e5 advance, one of the key ideas of this video here. Noted should be that if you gave white a couple moves, rook to d1 maybe to defend, but really rook f3 and rook over, this other knight will also get involved. Don't underestimate how dangerous this position is and how critical it is that black chooses the correct plan here. Okay, so assuming you paused your clocks, Kasparov played the move bishop takes d4 immediately. Knight to c6 is an interesting move that's always something that pops into my mind whenever I'm playing these positions personally, because I like the idea that if they take, I get to take the bishop with check. I can even move the queen to g5 and offer a potential queen trade, and I'm hoping that if pieces get simplified here, you can imagine who would be better. Ding, 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 usually black, right? Because on a structural level, black is much better after white makes these early advances in the Scheveningen, so make a mental note of that. And so black's really trying to simplify the position to liquefy some of white's pressure on the king side so that he'll just be positionally much better. But of course, if a move like rook d1 is played, we would get transpositions to exactly the kind of thing that happened in the game after bishop takes, and knight here. In the game here, rook f4 was played rather than rook d1. Rook d1 has also been tried, but here I guess white has the approach of defending the bishop as well as trying to get the rook lift started. But after the logical sequence of knight takes, queen to b6, rook a to d1, you can pause your clocks for a moment to see how direct black's plan should be here. Okay, assuming you did, the move is queen to c5, exclam, exposing the fact that the rook is pinned so there's no threats here. And immediately you see that it's a very direct approach. If we back up again and take a look at the last few moves, the move order notwithstanding, we are going to look at a couple other possibilities here for white besides queen h5. But in this very direct and what was very popular move order, Kasparov basically proved that black is ready to make a bunch of trades and simplify the position. And in doing so, he's just going to be positionally much better. Same types of tactics might have occurred after this. Takes, queen to b6, as I said, because rook d1 would be a direct transposition. And rook f4 doesn't really make a lot of sense here, putting the rooks in such awkward positions. So, in the game, it was rook f4 that was chosen. Chopalicious, bam, and queen to c5. Ouchtown for the e5 pawn. Here, white played the move knight to e4. But after queen takes e5, queen to f3, Kasparov was well prepared and ready to simplify the position with the move bishop to b7. A discovery like knight f6 check, there'd be several ways here for black to play, including queen takes b7, and knight to c5. If I really wanted to simplify everything, I'd be headed into a rook ending where I have essentially a two-pawn advantage with white's double pawns on the queen side. I have a 4-on-2, and with good technique, probably should be winning. Or I can keep the imbalance of the knight versus bishop, either by moving the knight to another square here, or in this position simply taking with the knight, and perhaps maybe taking a moment to free my back rank and begin the process of outplaying the white player. Queen e3 check followed by knight to g4 at some point is an idea, just not right away. So in this position, after bishop to b7, Tillerson sort of surrendered the idea of keeping the position dynamic. Took here, and after bishop takes e4, queen to e3, queen f5 was played. c3 to defend the c2 pawn, queen to g6, rook 1 to d2, rook a to c8, rook 7 to d4, bishop to f5, queen to e5, queen to f6. This sort of points out the fact that simplification is still on black's mind here. And after queen to d6, a5, a4. We're not spending too much time on this because I want to get back to the critical ideas of the structure. We're just going to show how Kasparov's technique was as usual, pretty flawless. Rook to c4 is an exclam move, forcing more simplification, obviously based on the deflection idea. And after bishop to b5, he traded on d4. Queen takes d4, e5, queen f2, and now, of course, you can see that the pawns are going to get rolling. c4, e4, queen d4, bishop g4. Of course, the pawn is still uncapturable. h4, queen to e7, queen to e3, and f5. Hopefully you can see here that it's pretty easy position for black, and he went on to win the game nicely. Back to one of our critical positions on move 12. I want to point out that, as I said, with bishop f4, there are several things to do here, including developing the bishop to c5 and trying to expose the pin. But theoretically, these days, the other way black plays is using the c5 square for the knight, rather, trying to eliminate one of the potentially more dangerous pieces. And lines show that black really simplifies the position nicely, and eventually is just positionally better. The next few moves would be something like rook f3 for white, usually trying to continue the idea of a rook lift and attacking. And after the move b4, knight c to e2, bishop b7, we see that one of the key things in this line is that black uses the e4 square for the bishop. Remember, this idea is a defensive method on the black side of a Scheveningen structure against white's early e5. The bishop putting itself here and eliminating white's light squared bishop will pretty much guarantee that black has zero issues on the king side. The bishop can't really be dislodged from a square like g6. The rook starts to feel silly, excuse me for being a little tongue-tied, and black will continue to develop play on the queen side and naturally eventually just be positionally much better. Also possible, instead of the move rook to f3, is the move knight c to e2 immediately, but after just natural development like bishop b7, c3, trying to, hopefully black forgets that he's supposed to eliminate this guy and lets me maintain attacking chances. But after black remembers, of course, and can play several moves here to maintain a slight edge, developing the knight and simplifying further as possible. But I'm pretty sure the strongest is a move like queen to d5. And after a move like knight to f3, we might even just play knight to d7. Either targeting this pawn or allowing an endgame to take place, and we can definitely see that black is potentially better in this position with a dominant bishop pair and access to all of the light squares here. The point is just to see how black is playing the Scheveningen structure against the early e5 push. What is he doing? He's emphasizing simplification. He's emphasizing trading and liquefying white's pressure, whether it was against queen h5 with the move bishop to c5 by Kasparov, bishop f4, we see the move knight to c5 being the most accurate. Bishop c5 is also interesting. And the next and other move possible for white is a move like even bishop to e3, sort of saying, I'm not going to waste my time trying to defend this weakness, but rather invite you to capture it and see if you can defend against the active pieces. Here you can pause your clocks for a moment to see if you want to find black's most accurate approach. Okay, well, assuming you did so, hopefully you just made the logical decision to say, well, I'm going to take that pawn. If white does nothing here, black's moves should pretty much play themselves. We want to play a move like knight to c6, trade off another set of pieces, obviously develop this bishop. If we ever had the opportunity to move that knight again, maybe to a5 or trade off dark square bishops, we would also take that option. And the best way for white to play is queen h5, and if you look at the games here, there are actually many. White has won some nice games, but I've sort of prepared it for you, so I'm going to give everybody what the best theoretical move is here, and that is queen to c7. Queen to c7 does a few things. It potentially sometimes prepares a move like knight to c4, which is just a solid position for the knight that attacks pieces and obviously invites a trade. But it's also sort of a high-class waiting move in that white doesn't really want to... black doesn't really want to commit any of the other pieces yet. He wants white to play the move bishop f4 first and allow this tactic, knight to c6. Looks strange, but the key is that on knight takes c6, we have the intermezzo check, queen to e3 check. Queen to b6 check, and after king h1, we take back with the knight, and white's pieces are slowly dwindling. We're threading the move knight to d4 to trade off more pieces, and also the move queen to c5. One option for white is to play the move king h1 here, trying to maintain the pressure of the pin and threaten knight takes c6, as obviously there's no more queen to b6 check. But here we can take on d4, as after bishop takes e5 we have a very strong and very important move to remember, a very common defensive move for black to kind of keep in his arsenal when it feels like white's pressure is becoming overwhelming and tactically he doesn't have any saving moves. Often there's this shot g6, trying to dislodge the queen. Point is, the queen has no safe squares to continue to guard the bishop, including e2. And if the move bishop takes c7 is played right away, we can play g takes h5. And the endgame here with an extra pawn for black is actually pretty good, despite the ruined kingside structure. We can eliminate the bishop on b3 if we need to, and the bishop pair is pretty dominant, along with the open files potentially for the rook. Some might argue it's better for white to actually try to take this pawn and equalize the material. But once again, after bishop to b7 and within the next move capturing here, it's actually hard to say which is better. Should black try to expose the king and hope for some tricky compensation, or play a position where material's equal like this, but really does not have very good chances at all to expect to win? There are no real tactics, of course, trying to take advantage of the king. Rook f3 is capturable. Rook f4 doesn't even threaten anything. And if you're not careful, I might even just be playing g5 and king g6 here and just using my overwhelming activity. I'm also threatening b4 with the c2 pawn hanging, which, of course, the exposing of the c file with a minority attack is about as common as a pattern you see in a Sicilian structure. So, bishop e3, we should be taking the pawn. Queen h5, we have this Kasparov stem game of bishop to c5 and knight to c6 ideas, and bishop f4 we use the c5 square for the knight. I know this has so far been almost like I'm sort of spoon-feeding you theory of a particular opening rather than a structure, but I kind of thought this first lecture might be like that because I wanted to show you that the sharpest lines of the Scheveningen structure, which the Sosa Najdorf, are about some of the sharpest stuff that it gets for white really trying to attack the king, outside of like English attack ideas, which, like I said, I'm putting in its own installment. I don't really, even though black can play a Scheveningen structure against an English attack, I'm kind of covering all that under the English attack umbrella, so we'll deal with that later. I just wanted to show you that even in the sharpest lines, with timely defensive moves, an early e5 push against a Scheveningen structure will backfire. This pawn is a positional weakness, and if black can simplify white's minor pieces, that's the idea when the pawn structure changes, you're going to see a positional advantage at the very least, if not a material advantage for black, when that e5 pawn becomes a real weakness. The other break of K that we need to mention here besides e5 is, of course, f5. Though in the Najdorf, it becomes pretty clear that white can't really afford to just put his head down and go for this positional idea. It looks really good and to open up the d5 square, but one of the major differences is how quickly black gets pressure against the e4 pawn. After moves like e5 and obvious developing moves like bishop b7, knight d7, and c5, again noted the different type of development than the Scheveningen knight to c6. This e pawn is a real issue. Here's an example line. First thing we do is we back up a couple moves. I just wanted to show you exactly what the transition idea is, but the main point is that, as I said, it's harder for white to just do this against the Najdorf because of the more advanced, more aggressive minority attack in the Najdorf. That is b4. First, we dislodge the knight from this key position that defends the e4 pawn. The knight can go to e2 or a4, but in either case, we're only then following up with e5, followed by the move bishop to b7, and all of a sudden white is really feeling the pain. A move like bishop to d5 here we could take either way, I think, with both the knight and the bishop, and maintain an advantage. Something like captures and queen a5 is one obvious idea. Positionally, white's structure is falling apart and he's not maintaining any control over those squares. So after bishop b7, knight to g3, something like knight takes e4 is actually possible, but just to prove the point, logical developing moves followed by a very typical plan that I mentioned in the first intro video when I was just kind of giving those positions where we take all the pieces off the board. Mentioned that one idea in the Scheveningen structure is the battery the queen and bishop can create on the queen side. After the move queen to f3, we see it in action. Bishop to c6, followed by the idea of queen to c7, queen to b7. A very common maneuver, really in any Najdorf and in any Sicilian, something that in a dream you could get this queen and bishop applying pressure to the critical squares, which by definition the queen is also well placed to help the advance of a minority attack. So doesn't really get much better as far as coordinating. Black is slightly better here, and no one at a high level ever plays this type of early advance of f5 against the Najdorf. So kind of showing that if we're calling this video the black stem game ideas, that the best way to do justice to how black's ideas really come together against those typical Scheveningen plans for white is with the Najdorf move order. So we've seen that f5 right away is not so bueno because of our more advanced minority attack. We looked at the variations with e5 and this pawn becoming a real target. So as I promised that we would talk about the best move order for white here, which is the move a3 rather. Now we can see there are a couple moves you can play here. You can play bishop b7 here and knight b to d7. Both are completely possible. I like to play the move knight b to d7 first. It is the Najdorf development, as we say, of the knight. Notice should be that tactics like this simply just don't work because I'm removing my queen with check, followed by moving the rook. And if I was getting really active pieces anyway, I would argue that even something like this is probably a pretty good example of 2 pieces for a rook, despite the fact that you want a couple pawns, but not really worth the argument because I can even just move my rook. I just wanted to point out that little tactical pattern, that it doesn't work here. And so after knight bd7, we see that we've actually eliminated e5. f5 is still a possibility, but after f5, e5, though we don't have b4 anymore, we've gotten an extra developing move. When this knight retreats, we pop into c5. We're threatening to eliminate this critical bishop. We're putting immediate pressure against the d5 pawn, the e4 pawn, and using the d5 square is not really going to save white from his problems here. Usually white will play the move bishop a2 here to try to save the light square bishop and hope that you fall prey for some sort of double attack tactic. But black is in no rush to take that backward and weak e4 pawn. Real quick, I guess I'll note that this doesn't really help. If I take with the knight here, if you take with your knight, e4 hangs, and in that case, there aren't really any tactics as far as taking and double attacking because we have bishop to b7 in the end. Real issues for white. These are common tactical patterns that occur in these structures that you should make note of. Let's see, taking with the pawn, I think I could even take here, and I wonder that even another move might make sense too, because I have the bishop pair, I have a protected pass e-pawn, and you don't really have a happy situation on the light squares because you don't want the pawns filling those squares if you're white. Obviously, we've said that before in the other videos. And of course, obviously taking with the queen would also allow an immediate bishop b7. So usually white will save the bishop this way, but again, bishop to b7, and now I am going to eliminate this pawn, if not next move, within a couple moves, and we see that black is not happy with this early f5 push. Note it should be that we can probably reach this same sort of position via this move order with bishop to b7 first, even if you played something like rook e1, knight to d7, f5, e5. Again, this position is still not a fun one for white. e4 is too weak. We're not really getting the access to the d5 square we want, and black is a happy camper. So after a3, knight bd7, the main move is bishop a2 right away. Now white usually plays the move, black usually plays the move bishop to b7 now. Still e5 is not an issue, not a possible, and after rook e1, now black plays knight to c5. Still, we already know what's going on with f5, and if e5, the key is that we're capturing here and putting a knight on e4. And the end of variations like this, you sort of see highlighted very well that the pieces have been simplified and traded off to a certain degree, and white has not really increased pressure on the king side, which means that the positional weakness on the e5 square, the pawn there, is going to tell some sort of story here. Queen to b6 makes sense, followed by putting the rooks on d8 and c8, maybe eventually a move like this. But these variations I sort of prepared for you to complement that first stem game I showed you by Kasparov, just to basically highlight the way black wants to develop in an ideal world via a Najdorf move order against the typical f4, e4 versus e6, d6, right? Notice also just that how much more aggressive the Najdorf move order is makes it very difficult for white to also have time for the typical g4, g5 plan that we saw in a lot of other regular Scheveningens in the first few videos in this installment. Because the pressure is coming so quickly to this center, it's very difficult for white to just buckle down and do that. So there are other variations of the Sozin, and there are other options for white to play in the Sozin. These days, when people do it, often you see different developments like bishop g5 and then queen to f3 early. White takes a different type of approach. Queen to b6, attacking the knight. If here I have bishop b7. Castles long, queen to b7. Normally black tries to emphasize this quick development of the knight to c5 to try to get rid of this attacker. I'm showing it to you because I always want to do justice. I don't like I said, I've criticized authors, and just one of my opinions is that I don't like when people provide information that's sort of makes you believe that one position is just totally good for one side. That's almost never true in chess. There are some openings that are just bad, but I believe that it's the mark of like a good author and a good teacher to be able to convince you that their ideas are correct and show you the absolute best information for the other player as well. So I don't want to sort of shield you to think that white is just worse in the Sozin, but I will say that those direct and aggressive ideas of just castling and early f4 are sort of a thing of the past because of the variations I've shown you today. So hopefully that should make you pretty confident about how black is playing against the Scheveningen structure. And again, so I would say that these days the way white likes to play a lot of the time is queen f3 early here and bishop g5 early. Bishop g5 even with castles short is still also possible after something like bishop b7, rook e1, knight to d7. There's eventually sometimes ideas where tactics like knight to d5 occur. We talked about those types of tactical ideas, and actually the last video we did from white's perspective when I told the famous Emery Tate stories. So there are other ways to play it, but again, the most aggressive approach and the most classical approach you think of from white's side of the Scheveningen, this type of approach is not really ideal for white anymore, and hopefully all the stem ideas I showed you today for black convinced you of that. And again, if you're a Sozin player out there looking for a recommendation from me, I recommend that if you're going to keep playing the Sozin rather than an English attack or a mainline bishop g5 against the Najdorf, I think that the answers or the best way for white to play are in variations like this. Black will try to emphasize this early development. White will try to get an attack on the king side, look for tactics with the knight d5 shots, and the positions are highly interesting. So hopefully you enjoyed this first video taking black's perspective in the Scheveningen. We probably will have a couple more on black's perspective before we move on to a totally new structure. And the Pawn Structure 101 train rolls on, doesn't it, everybody? Well, hop on, kids, because it's going to be a bumpy ride, and we still got a lot more to go. This series is probably going to be over 50 videos by the time we're done, and hopefully be something people can refer back to learn about every pawn structure known to man when it's over with. So I am happy to be here, and we're going to see you around on chess.com.